Allora, buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere qui. Cominciamo subito i lavori di questa mattinata che vedrà la presentazione del caso clinico da parte di Elisabetta Marchiori e poi una eterogenea tavola rotonda sul tema. Allora, però parlerò in inglese forse per i nostri relatori. So, good morning ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, thank you for being here with us today. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share with you these clinical cases, which will be presented by my dear colleague Elisabetta Marchiori. See, I will be slower. And I would like to present you our speakers of today, of this heterogeneous round table. So, first of all, our presenter, Elisabetta Marchiori, who is from Padua. And she's a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst and a PhD in psychiatric sciences. And then, ladies first, we have Celeste Vittoni, who is a psychologist as well, and she is a researcher in psychological sciences. She has been she's a student and fellow, and she works with Barry Komisaruk that you heard yesterday, and she works also with Jeff Kistner of the University of Padua. And then we have Daniela Flores Mosri from Mexico City, and she is a psychologist, PhD in psychoanalysis. She also a psychotherapist, a psychodynamic psychotherapist. She's lecturer and researcher and in the Universidad Intercontinental in Mexico City. And she also the general editor of the Neuropsychoanalytic Journal. So if you present a paper for the Journal of Neuropsychoanalysis, you have to contact Daniela. Then another lady down there, Juma Bazak. So Juma is a colleague from Calcutta, from India, and unfortunately there was a conference in New Delhi that our candidates attended, but she got COVID in the conference. So unfortunately today she will not be here with us, but she sent our comments on Lisa's case, and so Francesco will be so kind to read these comments. Okay, then we have Jeff Kistner from the University of Padua. He's an associate professor, and he's especially interested in psychoneuroendocrinology and psychoendocrinology, and so all the area of female sexuality is of particular interest for him. And then finally, last but not least, we have here Saran Titanopoulos. Many of you know him, and he's the president of the Società Psicoanalitica Italiana. And we are very honored to have him with us today. And he's also a collaborator for the Italian newspaper Manifesto. And he also has written many books. I will read just a few titles. I don't know if they are translated into English or not.
Two of them.
Two of them are also translated into English, but I will read them in Italian. Il desiderio che ama il lutto, desiderio e legge, il diavolo veste Isis, solo straniero di casa nostra. So it's a very interesting book about migration. And then la solitudine delle donne, so women's loneliness. È questo che è tradotto? Women's loneliness?
No.
And then la città e le sue emozioni. So we are really very happy to have him with us today. And now let's go on with the clinical case, and then we will have this discussion. Questo va? Bravo?
Good morning.
Si sente con questo?
Ok, grazie a tutti per essere qui. Si sente? Sì, ok, grazie. Mi sento più tranquilla a presentarvi il caso in italiano, quindi I feel more comfortable to present the case in Italian, and then I start.
Thank you, Lisa, for this really interesting case, which is so well related to the presentation yesterday, because it's so very close to all the theme of pain and pleasure. And so it's really a very, very rich case. Before giving the word to our panelists, I would like only to add one thing that, as Lisa mentioned, I had the opportunity to make an interview to this patient, and it was very clear to me that this patient has a genital problem, which is not a vulvodynia, which is what she has diagnosed. She had a diagnosis in a very famous Italian center, but she has instead a vaginismus, which is a condition which is different, but also often with an overlapping, which means that first she had a vaginismus and then she also had a vulvodynia. Now, we don't have time to go too much in the difference, which is quite sophisticated, but what I would like to underline is just this, that the terms that this patient uses, so there is a wall, and then she says, I don't have a hole, but I have a wall. This means it is pathognomonic of vaginismus. So this means that this patient doesn't have a mental representation of the vaginal space. And so penetration is not possible for this kind of patients. It is a very particular case. I've seen many, many patients with this problem. It's more or less 30 years that I work with them, and this is a typical case. Now, I would like to give the word. Who wants to start? Is there anybody who would like to start?
I will start. Juma will start.
Juma will start. Okay. Before starting again, I would like just to say a few words about Juma. As I said, she was really sorry to not having the possibility to be with us today. But just to say that she's a training analyst for the Indian Society of Psychoanalysis, and she published a book which is psychoanalytic perspectives on women in India. And she's very much close to all the theme of sexuality and pleasure in the woman, and she will say something specific about this subject. Thank you, Francesco.
Yes. Of course, I cannot mimicry a female voice, but please take it for granted. And yes, I will also add about the presentation about Juma, that I have been known since many, many, many years, that she is the daughter of a very famous traditional Indian dancer, and she was trained as an Indian dancer. And moreover, she's also a poet. She wrote a book of poetry, and as you maybe could even catch from this presentation, she has a really artistic sensibility about bodies. That's why I think the contribution would be very useful. I also ask her to provide a link, of course, with the Indian society and Indian culture about female bodies, in this sense, and is written here. So, as I was reading about Sarah, I was reminded of something that a revered dancer of the world had mentioned once, Martha Graham. She said that the body never lies. And it made me wonder, what is it that the body of Sarah was trying to express or protect, while her words are not yet found its expressions? It became imperative to try and listen intently to Sarah's symptoms of psychosomatic breakdown in order to understand her incomprehensive, unarticulated psychic conflicts and agonies. Was the physical fear of penetration in Sarah's symptoms of vaginismus an embodiment of the childhood unconscious fear of intrusions, of the mother's control, from which she spent my whole life at home trying to live? And perhaps I can almost imagine, that's the sensibility of Juma, I can almost imagine the gasping vaginal spasms in vulvodynia, wanting to breathe free, and perhaps her sexual route wanted a different course from the familiar upbringing and its sojourn. Added to that personal phobic tale of the mother-daughter encounter was the towering threat of a communal religious Catholic dogma on the individual. How terribly overwhelming the entire experience might have been for Sarah, that such a physical torment became Sarah's constant companion, like how a mother is a perpetual companion for a child, in the form of the symptom formation, arresting Sarah in her need to remain in close proximity of a distant mother who refused close physical contact, while at the same time trying to break free of her mother's intrusive control. That's the conflict. Perhaps it was also Sarah's way of an indirectly bodily connect with her own body, who was completely unable to express what her needs and desires might be. There is no room for any kind of pleasure. Was this painful physical attachment her internal understanding of bodily pleasure? Needless to say that Sarah may even want to protect this one singular body pleasure that was within her own autonomous jurisdiction from the intrusion of her analyst too, making the analytic work its element of resistance and defense more challenging to deal with. As a matter of fact, Sarah's sense of fragmentation was not only dividing her mind and body from each other, but was equally isolating her different body parts from each other, creating further estrangement within her own self-body reality. Quoting, Sarah's belly lived a life of its own. Her whole did not exist for Sarah. Perhaps all her symptoms, physical disgust, weight loss, colitis, were all taking us closer to the core of her being. Perhaps her sense of the pristine self was finding embodiment in the discourse of her genitals. Perhaps the analytic efforts towards an integrated mind-body resonance may offer us hope for the future, that it may unfold another radical, innovative sexual narrative for Sarah, that which is pleasure-oriented other than the one naturally inherited from the intrusive procreator, the mother, and Sarah's very religious, practicing, strict Catholic upbringing. Growing up in a culture, India, where the woman's entity has more embodied significance in mythological representation than in reality, there is a total negation of the woman's body in reality, making the mind-body integration a rare phenomenon for the living flesh and blood woman in India. Besides, the Eastern philosophy resonates the abstract mind-soul supremacy over the material body. So, the woman in India mostly grows up and lives with a deep physical and psychic fragmentation. Thus, the clinical space often witnesses more psychosomatic breakdowns that are more predominant in general. But symptoms of vulvodynia or vaginismus may mostly tend to go unnoticed, unidentified in such a context. Recognition or articulation of the woman's sexual body parts, vulva, vagina, may find some voice in maternal context, if at all, but definitely not in the narrative of mental health of women in general. The clinical fraternity may resonate such similar fragmentation in their diagnostic speculations as well. Claiming pleasure, particularly body pleasure, for the woman in India is still a very nascent, insurgent, perhaps a little in practice only, in the upper class, urban women. Orgasmic pleasure is still a rare phenomenon for the woman, whether in sexual discourse or in practice, since the woman's body, her sexual body parts, all remain obscure from affective cognitive integration or subjective-objective articulation. There exists a wall that obstructs all treatise of sexual evolution for the woman. To create this mind-body integration through the therapeutic model continues to be a difficult project for India, thereby making the talking cure still an unfamiliar, counter-resisting tool to healing. Thank you.
Thank you, Juma.
You're welcome.
No, a really touching report from this country. We know that, as Juma says, there is all this mythological attention, there is the Kama Sutra, there is this culture in Khajuraho, but then the situation with real women is very, very different. But anyway, I would suggest to go on, and I would like to listen to Jeff.
So I'm not a psychoanalyst, and I'm coming from a bit of a different perspective, and I'm primarily going to present some questions. Some are more sort of theoretically driven, some are more, or the last one will mostly just be out of curiosity. So in the last couple of days, slow down, okay. So in the last day or so, there has been a lot of discussion about the mind-body integration. And yesterday we heard a lot from the neuroscientists, and then we heard from the psychoanalysts, and there was a lot of sort of separation. I heard somebody say that it was like two islands, and we need to bring the islands together. I don't know who it was, I don't remember who it was that said that. That was you? It was beautiful, I liked it. And the directionality of bringing the mind-body together in the last day has primarily been going from the mind to the body in terms of psychosomatic symptoms. And I'm going to ask a question that maybe goes towards a different direction, and that is related to the menstrual cycle. There's a couple of details in this case presentation. Keep telling me when I go too fast. So there was just a few details in the case presentation related to the menstrual cycle. It had to do with painful menstruation, taking the pill for that, and having, in my opinion, this is indirectly related to the menstrual cycle, but taking or having a high iron diet, which wasn't explained. So I have to start with, we know from the case that that Sarah had painful menstruations. That's why she was taking the pill. Painful menstruations are oftentimes related to psychological distress. So there's a high correlation between physical symptoms of the menstrual cycle and psychological symptoms of the menstrual cycle. Oftentimes, without doing a careful assessment of day-to-day symptom changes across the menstrual cycle, this association gets overlooked. So for example, in one of my early studies, where I used daily assessment over 2 months of time, there was one person in 200 women, or one woman in the sample of 200, who had a diagnosis of depression. When I looked at her data of day-to-day assessment, it was clear that almost all of the changes in her mood were driven by her menstrual cycles. So she was going from basically a minimal score on depression to a maximal score on depression, and this was driven by the menstrual cycle. And so in my opinion, in that case, it was a misdiagnosis of premenstrual dysphoric disorder as depression. Okay, so if I have a case who has strong and very painful menstrual pains related to the menstrual cycle, I would ask the question whether other symptoms, like the psychological symptoms that she's experiencing, could also be driven by that, not to explain her vulvodynia or her vaginismus or all of the problems, but maybe to understand a portion of her psychological distress that could help guide her treatment. Related to that is the low or the potentially low iron, because she's taking a high iron diet, I presume to compensate for low iron in her blood, which to me suggests maybe she has a very abundant menstruation and would also then be consistent with maybe menstrual difficulties, hormonal difficulties. And I'm going to make one last little connection there with vulvodynia. And this is a little bit of a roundabout, that the painful menstruation could be related to endometriosis. Endometriosis shares some physiopathological processes with vulvodynia, specifically related to mast cell activation. And so I would try to get some more information on that whole picture of the biological processes linked with the menstrual cycle, the psychological symptoms, and the physical symptoms that she experiences with that. Then I'm going to ask one question about vaginismus, and this is where I'm just going out on a limb. It's very dangerous for me to go out here, but I'll throw it out there anyways. So reading the case and listening to the case now, she clearly has, at least for my reading, a dislike or hatred for the female figures in her life, her mother and her grandmother. The men, on the other hand, seem to be impotent, weak, large penis, but otherwise not a strong, dominant, or invasive personality. So I'm wondering why the hatred or dislike for the female figures and not the male figures is focused on her genitals. That's all in there.
I would like to answer this question, but later when we... Okay, so now I would leave Celeste first.
Okay. So I'm not a psychoanalyst either, and but we're trying to investigate vulvodynia better. And in the last year, we've been hearing a lot of people with vulvodynia sharing their experiences with us. Because we're building a study that is going to start in February, because we really don't know enough about this pathology or symptom. It's not really clear so far whether it's a pathology or a symptom, but what it's clear is that it can have different causes and it can have different profiles. It can be neuroproliferative vulvodynia, which is usually associated with an imbalance in hormonal levels, right, Jeff? Correct me if I'm wrong. It can be localized in different area of the vulva. If it's only confined to the vestibule, we talk about vestibulodynia. And there are different ways to deal with that. Usually, as far as understood, physiotherapy is suggested from the gynecologist, and this is where the patients start from. With this, usually, since there is an average diagnostic delay of 5 to 7 years, they also have to deal not just with the physical, but with the psychological pain, which I think this is really like a good place to talk about this, because we want to emphasize the integration between the brain, the mind, and the body, right? And so one thing that I brought up to the last conference, the first Italian conference Vulvodynia, when we were talking about this with physicians, is that I think it's really important to try to integrate the treatment of the mind, of the brain, with the treatment of the body, not just starting with the physical therapy. But the physical therapy, it's really important too, because as Elisabetta was underlying here, it seems like there is a non-integration of the genitals in the brain. So how do we do that? in neuroscience research, we see that if there is no stimulation, sensory stimulation, if there is no perception in the brain, we will not find a trace, like a synapse of that perception in the brain. There would be no space for that part of your body in your brain. With physical therapy, usually what they prescribe initially, it's also like self-massage, and after that the physical therapist herself started doing this type of increasing perception and stimulation of the genital. I think this is really important because this, together with psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, could accompany the patient in like understanding how to manage not just the pain that she feels from the body, but other types of sensation that she can perceive from the genitals, with the help of the psychotherapists that try to deal with the other aspect of the pain, which is the psychological pain. So I think, I don't know which diagnosis is more accurate in this case, because it's really complicated, because she's complaining about this constant burning and itching. I think that these are also clear symptoms if we talk with people with vulvodynia that are present, a continuous chronic kind of vulvodynia, which is the worst, which means that they might have problems going to bike, staying seated for too much time. So not just with penetration, this is something that can interfere with different aspects of your life, right? And I talked already about the therapy. And then I think it's also important to investigate the aspects in the relationships with Matteo, the boyfriend, or the boyfriend, but also with herself. So since I'm also being trained to become a sexologist, one of the things that I would investigate before and after the vulvar pain appeared, how was the relationship with her body? Did she ever masturbate? What did she feel? Which brings me to another point. Did she ever felt any kind of pleasure, not just in the body? Does she have any passion in her life? Does she have anything that makes her feel pleasure? Because another thing that as sexologists, Nan-wise, that we're collaborating with, is that this patient that usually brings up in therapy is sexual symptoms also have a history of anhedonia, which is related to Panksepp theory about not having like a hypoactivation of the seeking system. And if you don't have that, if you're not pushed to search for pleasure, you're gonna stop feeling it. You're not gonna search for it, and you're not gonna feel it. So I think it's a really complicated case. I hope some of my thinking will help you somehow, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Lester. It is very interesting what you said, and I perfectly agree. And also this patient, but then Lisa will comment again, but there is also depressive status. And you will speak also about the pharmacological therapy. So thank you very much. I would give to Daniela.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything said so far, and I find it, well, yeah, you can see my face now. Well, I find it a very suitable case to talk about neuropsychoanalysis, really. To me, there is a bridge concept which is affect, precisely, which you were finishing talking about that. So what I did was a bit of an analysis of all affects in the case, and then linked to the symptoms. And I find it a challenging case as well, because, well, my first diagnosis corresponds all right with depression, and I'm going to talk about affectively. The second thing that I tried to do, following what we heard yesterday in the talks, was trying to link some of what we learned yesterday to the case. And then I asked the question also related to what you were saying. I don't know the pronunciation in Italian, but Celeste. And I'll learn that later. And what I found was these two questions that Oliver brought to us, which were what happens before orgasm, if there is any, and what happens afterwards, what's going on with those neurochemicals. And I precisely came to this question. Is she seeking for something? Is she wanting something? And then I found probably yes, but not sexual intercourse. That's something that apparently she doesn't like. And I find many reasons for that. So the most immediate one is what she learned at home with her family, which is if you do something, then you're going to have to marry a person. It doesn't matter if he wants to marry or not. You will have to marry this person because it's the idea like it's wrong to have sex. So then she doesn't really want to explore that. But on the other hand, she constantly has relationships with men to the point of wanting to get married, even when she's ambivalent about that, or she was, because she got married in the end. So, so I see the instinct there. So if you go to the primary process, emotions, I see the instinct there. What I see is a problem with the secondary process, learnings, where she's associating things that are not pleasant and that she feels are wrong. So I think that's where the loss system is basically running through a sort of shutdown, though she explores sexuality with her boyfriend, the previous boyfriend that apparently causes the first crisis, and then with her husband-to-be and then husband. So those before chemicals, I find probably low activation of dopamine in the seeking system, the basically mesolimbic mesocortical pathway of dopamine, which is a problem in the start, because then if you're not seeking, you're not going to find anything. There's not going to be any sort of pleasure or satisfaction. So that's a major problem, because some people seek and just don't know how to find what they're looking for. But in this problem, it's even worse. It's like, I'm not really looking for anything. And then she knows being married or having a boyfriend means some sort of sexual interaction. And then she tries, painfully, and she tries. She knows she has to try. So yesterday we heard as well about this correlation. It's a correlation, yes, between pain and pleasure, which is not happening here because of the mixed secondary process associations. So she gets more pain when she's stimulated instead of reducing the pain that we learned from yesterday. And then comes probably the core problem of the case, which is being with others. So I think she has problems with both females and males, women and men. Women because they are there to support you, like in her dream with the sister and the mother. But at the same time, they push you. They make you feel pressure, so that it's not the feeling of holding from someone. And men are sort of passive figures who don't do anything to help her. So I think the main problem there, of course, it's the fear of rejection. And she's been rejected because then she has this story about her childhood in which the mother wasn't there because she was working. The grandmother was there, but she was quite controlling and apparently obsessive with cleanliness. So it's the same thing. It's like everything dirty is going to be a problem in your life. So you need to try to control, which is probably the main defense mechanism. And then what happens as well is needing someone and not being able to have access to that person. So then I'm going to close a wall, not a door, but it's even a wall. You can't come in. You simply can't come in. I'm not going to let you in. And that's the other very cruel story about not being cradled by the mother. And she knows there's this story like, I did it too much with my own brother, so I'm not going to do it with my children. So I think that's a very cruel thing to know, and I'm wondering why she knows. It's something, I mean, if the mom did it, then why would she tell? But anyway, so then I have many comments there, but then falling in love, I think, means for her losing control, which is unacceptable. And then she becomes really angry. She becomes basically enraged about it. And I think that's in the countertransference a lot. Like why she's so childish and all these feelings like, I don't even believe you, like your stories are so bad in a way. But she's hostile, so that means she's quite angry. I think that's a very important feeling there. And the most important one in terms of a panic grief problem there with the separation distress, highly active. Then we have opioids, they're running. And that's unfortunately the combination where you have too much kappa opioid receptor activity, then you're going to shut down the dopamine pathway, and that means depression. I mean, that's a very clear combination. So that's why I say she's clearly depressed. She's trying, which is the good news, and she's looking for help. I think that's very, very good. So there's some sort of motivation, some sort of seeking activity. But I think it was quite right to prescribe some sort of antidepressant just to help the therapeutic process. So then just to sum up, if we go to the affective things, we go to neurochemistry, then of course we go to the neuroanatomy, and I think that we know something that Oliver pointed out yesterday as well, which is what is this patient feeling? So we need to understand what she's feeling in this whole mess of relationships that she wants to have, but she's too scared of having, and with good reason, unfortunately. So thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Yes, the big contrast with this patient is what they have in mind. They want the intercourse, they want the wedding, they want the marriage, they want the relationship, but then they're not able to be physically with their partner. So it's a big problem for them. But I would like to listen to Cervantes now.
Grazie, grazie dell'invito. Prima di tutto la Staff Psicanalitica Italiana sostiene il vostro lavoro e sostiene la collaborazione con le neuroscienze. Abbiamo già un gruppo di ricerca comune con il gruppo di Vittorio Gallese, con la partecipazione anche dei filosofi, e una cosa importante è studiare non il cervello in se stesso, ma le relazioni. E le relazioni umane è molto importante il fatto che si raccolgono dati che sono importanti, una miniera di informazioni per tutti noi, è una miniera di informazioni per tutti noi, e io penso che i neuroscienziati dispongono di molte cose che possono essere utili per la comprensione delle nostre relazioni, e loro penso potrebbero usufruire delle nostre capacità interpretative. E mi auguro quindi che lo spazio di questa collaborazione si allarghi. Devo dire che viviamo in un modo molto difficile, il breve caso clinico mi è piaciuto molto, è paradigmatico, coglie in poche righe, direi, no? Per la complessità del fenomeno, una serie di questioni straordinarie. Sicuramente soffre oggi l'orgasmo femminile, soffre come profondità di coinvolgimento, e la donna è più sola che mai, nel senso che nell'orgasmo femminile collaborano l'orgasmo clitorideo e l'orgasmo vaginale. Questa collaborazione è molto importante, per cui anche l'autoritismo femminile è molto diverso da questo maschile, è molto più profondo e non è esattamente un autoerotismo.
Più complicato, possiamo dire.
Più complesso, più ricco. Voi sapete che a un certo punto finisce il rapporto erotico e l'uomo già si stacca, ma la donna resta nell'intimità. Questa è la solitudine della donna, che è fondamentale per l'essere umano, perché in questo momento della solitudine sua, che l'uomo già se ne ha dato, la donna che resta ancora nelle emozioni, nelle sensazioni, non è sola, perché le sue sensazioni misurano tutti i ritmi del mondo. E se noi abbiamo un contatto con il respiro del mondo, l'abbiamo grazie a questa solitudine della donna. Però rischiamo di renderla sola rispetto a se stessa. Il caso mi ha fatto pensare a una vecchia situazione, una mia paziente che era stata abusata dal fratello, assolto dai genitori perché non l'aveva penetrata, e ha fatto un sogno in cui delle formiche mangiavano una baracca di legno, se non che mi ha detto che l'abuso era stato nella baracca e che lei per molto tempo, dopo questo abuso, era balbuziente e soffriva di un prurito. E le formiche erano il formicolio o l'eccitazione, che non poteva andare in profondità perché lei sarebbe mangiata. E quindi mi ricorda molto quello che tu dicevi a proposito dell'elettrostimolazione, che faceva vibrare tutto tranne che nel luogo in cui c'era il dolore, perché queste vibrazioni vengono sentite come pericolo. L'eccitazione deve rimanere in superficie, se va in profondità è un disastro. Ed è molto interessante che lei dice, parlando del matrimonio, i preparativi mi fanno impazzire, no? Perché mi creano emozioni e allora io ho paura, salta tutto, però poi piange. Il coinvolgimento erotico che non può avvenire diventa pianto, e il pianto è una forma di coinvolgimento affettivo fondamentale. Significa che questa donna che è così contratta, così, che soffre di vulvodinia, è viva dentro, e questa è la cosa più fondamentale. Certo, c'è una questione di fondo, che la donna ha bisogno di spazio. Un'altra questione che si pone, l'orgasmo femminile, il piacere femminile ha bisogno di spazio, non può essere soffocata, e la sessualità della donna è espansiva, e quindi se blocchiamo questa espansività, se la soffichiamo, non riesce ad andare da nessuna parte, non solo la donna ma anche l'uomo. Ed è molto importante che poi questo soffocamento che vive la porta ad avere paura dell'aprirsi perché è la vera questione di fondo. Se mi apro mi perdo, se mi lascio andare, e quello che dice alla fine è importante per questa donna. Lasciarsi andare, l'orgasmo, il piacere sono una perdita di senso, non riesce a significarli. Non ha a che fare con il piacere che non può vivere, ma il fatto che perde il senso, la frammentazione psichica, fisica, come dicevi. Perché per la donna è molto importante che sia sostenuto questa espansione del suo desiderio. Se non è sostenuta, crolla tutto miserabilmente. È un terremoto interno. Qualsiasi cosa che non la porta a sentirsi a suo agio, la vive come un crollo interno, come un'emorragia intollerabile. E questo penso che sia fondamentale per tutti noi, perché nel mondo in cui viviamo questo sta diventando più la regola che l'eccezione. Vorrei concludere con una considerazione che riguarda la difficoltà di essere madre. Ecco, il rischio è, nelle mie analizzante donne che hanno paura di fare dei figli, la questione che sempre ricorre è questa: questo figlio è il figlio maschio che non ha questo spazio, ha lo spazio dell'erezione, è tutto diverso dallo spazio del lasciarsi andare. È un figlio che faccio col mio uomo o un figlio che faccio per mia madre? E di fronte a questo conflitto non fanno il figlio. E paradossalmente questo conflitto è più sano che fare un figlio per regalarlo alla madre. Ultima considerazione, questa della lacerazione. Il pene grosso, il pene pendente sono chiare naturalmente. E l'idea della lacerazione nasce dal fatto anche che per le donne sempre di più c'è una spinta di cui noi tutti siamo responsabili, no? A identificarsi con l'uomo, con il funzionamento dell'uomo. E questa identificazione con l'uomo, che distruggerebbe la nostra civiltà, è una violenza interna per la donna. Grazie.
Grazie. Thank you, Sarantis, for all this consideration, and you had the gift to summarize in a few words really many deep and problematic problems of this case. I don't know if Lisa wants to say something more, or you can say just... Juma want to say a few things, but very...
As Juma, I'm deeply agree with you, of course, because you came back to the question of the pressure of the culture over the body, so the cultural body. And Juma would deeply agree with you, because the theme of this case is also, we could label it as a sort of genital mutilation. And genital mutilation is a phenomenon that is described in Africa, but actually is widespread also in Italy, not only in India. It's a different kind of mutilation, not really bodily, but mentally. And the embodiment is prohibited in a way, is not facilitated by the culture. Okay.
See, I would like, before finishing, I would like just to answer to Jeff's question about the transgenerational transmission of the problems related to sexuality. And in this patient, we could say that if we see from a Winnicottian point of view, there is a total lack of holding and handling of this patient. She has never been touched by the mother. And in this patient with these kind of problems, usually there is a transgenerational difficulty in touching the body and particularly in touching the genitals. So these patients are never properly, these baby girls are never properly touched and taken care of. So probably, and we can see there is a great-grandmother, a grandmother, and the mother, which are very obsessive with cleaning. So probably there is something which didn't go in a fine way about this bodily perception. And if there is a lack of holding and handling, there is also a lack of perception. And the perception of the vaginal internal space is something which starts with puberty, but which goes back to very precocious phases of life. So I think that this is the whole problematic area in this case. And generally speaking, these patients, they erect a wall which is against a psychic breakdown. So they are aware that if there is the penetration, there is a sudden breakdown, a psychotic breakdown. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for your attention. We now have 15 minutes for a quick coffee, and then there will be the discussion with the audience, okay?